How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle, by Ray Dalio. Hey there, grab a seat. Ever notice how the world feels like it's on a roller coaster? One minute everything's booming, people are optimistic, money's flowing freely. The next minute, crisis mode, debt spirals, talk of collapse. It's like watching massive ocean waves crash toward shore, powerful and unpredictable, seemingly appearing from nowhere. But here's the thing. What if these waves aren't random at all? What if there's an actual pattern underneath it all, a rhythm as ancient as civilization itself? A pattern that explains why empires crumble, fortunes vanish overnight, and even the most powerful nations can suddenly find themselves broke. Today we're exploring a fascinating book that maps out these very currents of history. It's called How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle, written by Ray Dalio. Now, Ray isn't some armchair economist. He spent over 50 years navigating the wild waters of global finance as an investor, founding Bridgewater Associates, which grew into the world's largest hedge fund. Picture dedicating your entire career to understanding the global economic machine, not just intellectually, but because you had real money on the line every single day. That relentless pursuit, backed by massive resources and decades of study, revealed patterns that even seasoned economists typically miss. This book isn't just economic theory. It's the culmination of a lifetime studying history's greatest booms and busts, searching for the timeless forces that drive them. Dalio believes he's uncovered a fundamental template, a big cycle, that governs how nations rise and fall, driven primarily by something deceptively simple: debt. He's sharing this knowledge not just for economists or Wall Street types, but for everyone: policymakers, regular citizens, and especially young people like you who are trying to make sense of this complex world you're inheriting. Because Dalio believes we're currently living through a critical phase of this big cycle, a time of potentially massive change, similar to other pivotal moments in history. So what's in it for you today? By the time we're done, you'll have a unique lens for viewing the world. You'll understand this hidden engine of debt cycles and how it shapes economies, politics, and even global power dynamics. You'll see why Dalio believes history rhymes and how understanding the past offers invaluable clues about the future. It's a journey into the heart of how the economic machine really works, stripped down to its essential, powerful truths. Sound good? Let's dive in. At its core, Dalio's idea starts with something incredibly ordinary: credit. Think about it. Credit is basically economic time travel. It lets you spend money you don't have yet. For individuals, that might mean buying a car or house. For governments, it's roads, programs, infrastructure. When credit flows easily, people spend more, businesses invest more, incomes rise, asset prices climb upward. Everyone feels wealthier, happier. It's intoxicating. And precisely because it feels so good, there's a natural bias, especially for governments and central banks, to create more of it. But here's the unavoidable truth. Credit creates debt. And debt is a promise to pay back more money later, the original amount, plus interest. So while borrowing lets you spend more today, paying back debt forces you to spend less tomorrow. One person's spending is another person's income, right? When borrowing is high, incomes are high. When debt repayment kicks in, spending slows, and incomes tend to fall. This dynamic, Dalio explains, is inherently cyclical. Most of us know the short-term debt cycle, usually called the business cycle. It typically runs about 6 years or so. It works like this. The economy slows down, inflation drops. So the central bank, like the Federal Reserve, makes money easier and cheaper to borrow by lowering interest rates. This encourages borrowing and spending. The economy heats up, asset prices rise, maybe things get a bit too hot, and inflation starts climbing. Then the central bank hits the brakes, raises interest rates, makes borrowing more expensive. People borrow and spend less. The economy cools, inflation falls, and the whole thing starts over. We've all lived through several of these. But here's what Dalio wants you to notice. These short-term cycles don't just repeat, they accumulate. Because of that bias toward creating credit, that desire to keep good times rolling and stimulate growth, Each cycle tends to end with slightly more debt than the previous one. Imagine climbing stairs where each step up is slightly higher than the step down you just took. Over decades, this gradual accumulation builds into something far more significant: the big debt cycle. This big cycle typically lasts about a lifetime, roughly 80 years, give or take 25. Early in this cycle, when overall debt levels are low relative to incomes, borrowing feels safe and productive. Memories of past crises might make people cautious, but generally, credit fuels growth, innovation thrives, and wealth increases. But as decades pass, and short-term cycle after short-term cycle adds more debt, things shift. Debt levels become enormous, not just for individuals or companies, but often for governments themselves. The promises made, the debts owed, start looking massive compared to the income available to pay them back. Dalio uses a striking analogy. Debt growing faster than income is like a cancer, slowly destroying purchasing power. When this point arrives, the central bank faces a brutal choice. Option A: let widespread defaults happen. Businesses fail, banks collapse, people lose their savings, the economy plunges into a deflationary depression. Option B: create vast amounts of new money, essentially print money, to bail out debtors and keep the system functioning. This devalues existing money, meaning each dollar buys less, causing inflation, potentially runaway inflation. Dalio's study of hundreds of years of history across many countries reveals an unwavering pattern. When faced with this choice, central banks always eventually choose to print the money. Why? Because the social and political pain of a massive deflationary collapse is typically deemed unbearable. But either way, default or devaluation, the outcome is the same for those holding the debt. Like bonds, they lose wealth, their store of value evaporates. This is a crucial point often missed, Dalio notes. Credit rating agencies rate the risk of default, but not the risk of devaluation through money printing, creating a false sense of security for holders of government debt, especially for countries that can print their own currency. So how does this big debt cycle typically unfold? Dalio breaks it down into stages, much like tracking the progression of an illness, each with distinct symptoms. Stage 1. The sound money stage. This is the early phase. Debt levels are low relative to income. Money is often hard, maybe linked to gold or something tangible, limiting how much can be created. Debt growth fuels productive investments, leading to healthy economic growth and rising prosperity. Confidence builds. Think of the period after World War II in the United States as an example. Stage 2. The debt bubble stage. Things start getting excessive. Fueled by optimism and readily available, cheap credit, debt grows much faster than income. People and institutions borrow heavily, not just for productive investments, but increasingly for speculation, buying assets simply because they expect prices to keep rising. Amazing new technologies often emerge during this stage, fueling excitement and investment, sometimes without much regard for actual profitability. Think of the dot-com bubble or aspects of recent tech booms. Everyone seems to be making money, wealth feels like it's appearing out of thin air, but it's built on an increasingly shaky foundation of debt. Dalio has a bubble indicator that looks for signs like debt growing significantly faster than income for several years, asset prices becoming extremely high compared to historical norms, and widespread bullish sentiment. Stage 3, the top stage. The bubble inevitably pops. This usually happens when the central bank tightens credit, raising interest rates to cool things down, or simply because the rate of debt growth becomes mathematically impossible to sustain. Like pulling a single block from a Jenga tower that brings everything down, problems start small but spread rapidly as defaults begin, assets get sold, prices fall, and credit dries up. Policymakers might try temporarily reversing the contraction by injecting more credit, but eventually the system reaches a point where this stops working. Stage 4. The deleveraging stage. This is the painful but necessary correction. Debt burdens simply must come down relative to incomes. This process typically starts in the private sector, households and businesses. As they struggle, government often steps in to help, taking on more debt itself. But eventually, government itself might face a squeeze, finding it hard to borrow enough money. Investors, fearing they won't get their money back or that it'll be devalued, start selling government debt. This is a major red flag. Selling drives interest rates up, making the government's debt problem even worse, creating a vicious cycle, what Dalio calls a death spiral. Austerity, cutting government spending, often makes things worse at this stage, because cutting spending reduces incomes throughout the economy, potentially increasing the debt-to-income ratio. This is when the central bank is forced to act decisively. If the debt is in a currency it can print, it'll start creating money on a massive scale, quantitative easing or QE, to buy government debt and potentially other assets, trying to push interest rates down and keep credit flowing. It'll likely also try to devalue the currency to stimulate the economy and fight deflation. Governments might resort to extraordinary measures, like capital controls, preventing money from leaving the country, or even seizing assets in extreme cases. The goal of this stage, whether managed well or poorly, is to reduce the overall debt burden, typically needing to cut the debt-to-income ratio significantly, maybe by around half. Dalio calls the ideal outcome a beautiful deleveraging. This involves a skillful balance, using debt restructurings, like extending repayment times or reducing amounts owed, which are deflationary, combined with printing money, which is inflationary. Get the balance right, and you can reduce debt burdens while maintaining positive economic growth and acceptable inflation. Get it wrong, and you get either a crushing depression or hyperinflation. Stage 5. The big debt crisis recedes and return to hard money. Eventually, through some combination of defaults, restructurings, and money printing, debt burdens get reduced to sustainable levels. A new equilibrium starts forming. But confidence is shattered, especially among lenders who got burned. To restore credibility, governments and central banks often need to take strong actions. This might involve getting government finances back in order, spending less than they earn, and making the currency hard, again, perhaps by linking it back to something tangible, or offering very high real interest rates significantly above inflation, to reward saving and lending. This phase is often painful for borrowers but attractive for lenders, rebuilding the foundation for the next cycle to begin. Dalio also notes that the type of monetary policy central banks use changes as the big debt cycle progresses, acting like signposts showing roughly where we are. He calls the early stage, often with currency linked to gold, MP0, monetary policy 0. This usually ends when the link breaks under pressure. Then comes MP1, where central banks manage a fiat, unbacked currency, mainly by adjusting interest rates. This works until interest rates hit 0 and can't go lower. The U.S. was in this phase, roughly from 1971 to 2008. Next is MP2, where central banks, unable to lower interest rates further, resort to printing money and buying financial assets like government bonds and mortgages, quantitative easing, QE. This helps asset prices, but doesn't always effectively get money to those who need it most. The U.S. entered this phase in 2008. Finally, when MP2 isn't enough, especially during major crises, we might see MP3. This involves direct coordination between the central government, fiscal policy, spending and taxing, and the central bank, monetary policy, money printing, to get money and credit directly into the hands of people and businesses. Think of the large government stimulus checks combined with central bank bond buying during the COVID pandemic. This is powerful, but carries significant risks of inflation and further devaluing the currency. These phases ultimately lead to the big deleveraging, stage 4 described above, followed eventually by a return to hard money principles, stage 5. Understanding this progression, private sector debt problems leading to government debt problems leading to central bank intervention and potential crisis, is key. Dalio even describes how a central bank itself can effectively go broke, not by defaulting, but by getting into a situation where its liabilities, the money it owes, like reserves to commercial banks, cost more in interest than it earns on its assets, the bonds it bought, forcing it to print even more money just to cover its own negative cash flow, potentially accelerating the devaluation spiral. Now, Dalio emphasizes that this debt cycle, while hugely important, doesn't happen in isolation. It interacts with four other massive forces that together shape the overall big cycle of history. These forces are: 1. The internal order and disorder cycle. This refers to cycles of peace, prosperity, and cooperation within a country versus periods of conflict, polarization, and sometimes even civil war. These cycles are often driven by widening wealth and values gaps, ineffective governance, and fights over resources and power. Periods of economic hardship, often linked to the debt cycle, tend to worsen internal conflict. Dalio notes that history shows a pattern where failing democracies, unable to cope with deep divisions and crises, sometimes give way to more autocratic leaders who promise order. 2. The external order and disorder cycle. This concerns relationships between countries, periods of peace, trade, and cooperation, versus periods of competition, conflict, and war that changed the global power structure, the world order. A rising power challenging a dominant power is a classic setup for conflict. Economic strength, often fueled early in a debt cycle, translates into global influence and military power, while economic weakness, often late in a debt cycle, can lead to declining international standing. Dalio observes a current shift away from global cooperation, multilateralism, toward nations prioritizing their own interests, unilateralism, a trend typical of late-cycle periods. 3. Acts of nature, droughts, floods, pandemics. These unpredictable events can have devastating impacts, destroying wealth, disrupting economies, and sometimes even triggering social unrest or toppling governments, especially if they hit when finances are already strained. Dalio notes these seem to be increasing in frequency and cost. 4. Human inventiveness and technology. This is the force driving long-term productivity growth and improvements in living standards. New technologies can create booms and sometimes bubbles, reshape industries, shift economic power, and even alter warfare. We're currently experiencing a potentially revolutionary wave with AI. However, Dalio cautions that even powerful technological advances can be overshadowed or crushed if the other negative forces, debt crises, internal conflict, external war, become dominant. These five forces interact constantly, often reinforcing each other. A bad debt crisis can fuel internal conflict, which can weaken a country externally, making it vulnerable. A major war necessitates huge borrowing, dramatically impacting the debt cycle. A pandemic disrupts everything. New technology creates wealth, potentially widening inequality and fueling internal tensions. Understanding this interplay is crucial to grasping the bigger picture of the overall big cycle. Dalio also shares his unconventional but, he argues, more practical way of thinking about supply, demand, and prices. Forget complex charts, he says. Just focus on the basics. Price simply equals the total amount of money and credit spent divided by the total quantity of the item sold. If you want to understand why a price changes, figure out who the main buyers and sellers are, why they're motivated to spend what they spend or sell what they sell, and estimate those two totals. This approach makes it clear that cycles are driven more by changes in spending, often fueled by money and credit creation, than by changes in quantity. It also explains why creating more money leads to growth. When there's spare capacity, quantity can increase, but leads to inflation when capacity is tight, quantity can't increase much. He applies this framework to understand debt crises too. Policymakers often think they can restore confidence psychologically, overlooking the mechanics. But if the flows show that the amount of debt needing to be sold, dollars needed by sellers and borrowers, vastly exceeds the amount buyers are willing or able to spend, dollars available from buyers and lenders, at current prices, interest rates, A crisis is inevitable unless the central bank steps in to bridge the gap by creating more money. Dalio then uses simple mathematical relationships, which we don't need to dive deeply into here, to show how debt burdens compound and become unsustainable. The key factors are the starting level of debt relative to income, the debt service, interest plus principal payments relative to income, the nominal interest rate compared to the nominal income growth rate. If interest rates are higher than growth, the debt burden grows even if you don't borrow more, and the amount of savings or reserves available to cushion shocks. Watching these ratios helps gauge the risk. He shows, for instance, how even moderate deficits can cause debt-to-income ratios to balloon over time if starting debt is already high, and how rising interest rates dramatically worsen the picture, potentially triggering that death spiral. To illustrate these cycles in action, Dalio briefly walks through history. He shows the U.S. cycle from 1865 to 1945, the post-Civil War boom, the Gilded Age wealth gaps, the debt busts leading to the Fed's creation, World War I, the Roaring Twenties bubble, the 1929 crash and Great Depression, Roosevelt breaking the gold link, an MP0 to MP1 shift, and World War II resetting the global order and debt levels. Then he examines the current big cycle starting in 1945. 1945 to 1971, MP0, the Bretton Woods system, dollar linked to gold, U.S. dominance, post-war boom, rebuilding Europe and Japan, gradual buildup of U.S. spending, Vietnam, social programs, leading to too many dollar claims on too little gold. This ended with Nixon breaking the gold link in 1971, a classic default on the promise of hard money. Dalio personally experienced this shock and learned how currency devaluations actually boost markets initially by easing debt burdens. 1971 to 2008, MP1, the fiat money era managed by interest rates. The 1970s saw high inflation, stagflation, as money printing continued, benefiting debtors and hurting creditors. This led to Paul Volcker's drastic tightening around 1980, jacking up interest rates to crush inflation. This reversed conditions. The 1980s favored creditors, crushed debtors, especially emerging markets with dollar debt, saw falling inflation, strong growth, and booming stock and bond markets in developed countries. This period also saw the rise of globalization, the fall of the Soviet Union, partly due to economic strain, and the beginning of China's economic ascent under Deng Xiaoping. The 1990s continued disinflation, saw tech booms, the dot-com bubble, and various regional debt crises, Asia, Russia. The dot-com bubble burst in 2000, followed by 9/11, leading to easing and fueling the next bubble in housing and mortgages. Throughout this MP1 phase, interest rates generally trended downward, allowing debt burdens to keep growing. 2008 to 2020, MP2, the global financial crisis hit. Interest rates hit zero, forcing central banks globally into QE, MP2, massive money printing and asset buying. This propped up financial assets, benefiting the wealthy, but didn't always translate to broad economic recovery, increasing wealth gaps and social tensions. This period saw rising populism and political polarization, Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party, Trump's election, fueled by economic anxieties and perceived unfairness. The U.S.-China relationship shifted from cooperation to competition and conflict. Since 2020, MP3 and beyond, the COVID pandemic triggered a massive coordinated fiscal and monetary response. MP3, governments spent huge sums, and central banks printed money to finance it. This led to a surge in inflation. Central banks then tightened sharply, raising rates significantly. Inflation has since cooled, but government debt levels are extremely high, particularly in the U.S., and projected to grow further. Dalio also highlights crucial lessons from Japan. After its massive bubble burst around 1990, Japan failed to execute a beautiful deleveraging for decades. They didn't restructure bad debts quickly enough and kept monetary policy too tight for too long, leading to decades of stagnation and deflation, the lost decades. Only much later, around 2013, did they aggressively embrace massive QE and negative interest rates. This finally led to currency devaluation and some economic relief, but at the cost of significantly eroding the wealth of Japanese bondholders and the international purchasing power of Japanese citizens. Japan's experience serves as a stark warning about the consequences of mismanaging the deleveraging phase. China is presented as another vital case study. After decades of explosive growth fueled by reforms and significant debt accumulation, especially after 2008, China is now grappling with its own major debt problems, particularly in real estate and local government financing. While China has tools Japan lacked, like state control and debts mostly in its own currency, it faces challenges: managing the deleveraging without derailing growth, dealing with internal pressures, common prosperity, goals, social control, navigating intense external conflict with the U.S., and dependence on global trade amid rising protectionism. How China manages its current late-stage debt cycle will have enormous global consequences. Looking at the present situation, particularly in the U.S., Dalio's indicators suggest very high long-term government debt risk, but low immediate short-term risk. The projected path of U.S. government debt and deficits is unsustainable, nearing a potential point of no return without significant changes. The main buffer currently is the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, creating demand for U.S. debt. However, Dalio warns this privilege can be lost if abused through excessive borrowing and money printing. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet also shows long-term vulnerabilities, high debt holdings, recent operating losses, though not yet at crisis levels. The big red flags to watch for would be a return to massive QE or signs of the government overtly controlling the central bank. Given this precarious long-term outlook for the U.S., Dalio proposes a solution he calls the 3% three-part solution. The goal is to cut the projected U.S. budget deficit roughly in half, from about 6% of GDP down to a more sustainable 3%. This 3% of GDP cut can come from three levers: spending cuts, tax increases, and importantly, interest rate reductions engineered by the Federal Reserve. He argues that relying only on spending cuts or tax hikes would be too painful, but a balanced approach, including cooperation from the Fed to lower interest costs, which are a huge part of the deficit, could stabilize the debt trajectory without crashing the economy. He stresses the need for bipartisan agreement and suggests a fallback plan of automatic, proportional cuts and tax hikes if politicians can't agree on specifics, to ensure the target is met. He believes achieving this fiscal consolidation now, while the economy is relatively stable, is crucial to avoid a much worse crisis later. So where does this leave us? Dalio sees the world, particularly the U.S., as being late in the big cycle, roughly 80 years since the current world order began in 1945. The convergence of late-stage debt cycles, high internal conflict, political polarization, rising external conflict, U.S.-China rivalry, increasing pressures from nature, climate change, and revolutionary technology, AI, creates a period of high risk and uncertainty, analogous to the 1930s leading up to World War II. He believes the next 5 to 10 years will likely bring enormous changes to the monetary, political, and global orders. While powerful new technologies offer hope for productivity gains, he suspects they may not be enough to overcome the headwinds from the other negative forces, unless those forces are managed exceptionally well. The future, while shaped by these powerful cyclical forces, isn't predetermined. It depends heavily on the choices made by leaders and citizens today. Understanding these cycles, Dalio argues, is our best tool for navigating the challenging, transformative times ahead. That's a lot to absorb, right? Ray Dalio paints a vast, sweeping picture of history, driven by forces that feel almost planetary in scale. The idea that these massive booms and busts, these shifts in global power, aren't just random events but follow a predictable, mechanical cycle centered around debt, It's both unsettling and incredibly illuminating. What strikes me most is the sense of inevitability Dalio conveys, not necessarily of disaster, but of the cycle itself. Humans, whether acting as individuals, companies, or governments, seem naturally inclined to push the boundaries of credit, to reach for more now, often underestimating the consequences later. And when the bill comes due, the responses, the political battles, the central bank interventions, the devaluations, also follow a well-worn script, played out countless times across centuries and continents. Reading this, you might feel some unease, especially hearing about the late stage of the cycle and the parallels to turbulent times like the 1930s. That's natural. But Dalio's purpose isn't to frighten, it's to empower. Knowledge, understanding the mechanics of how things work, removes the terror of the unknown. Seeing the patterns allows us to anticipate, to prepare, and perhaps even to influence the path forward. For someone your age, standing at the threshold of your adult life, this perspective is invaluable. You're inheriting a world shaped by these long-term cycles. Understanding them helps make sense of the headlines, the political debates about debt and spending, the tensions between nations, the booms and busts that'll undoubtedly shape your career and financial future. It provides a framework, a mental model for navigating complexity. So what can you take away from this practically, starting today? First, pay attention to debt. Not just headlines about the national debt, but debt in all its forms: personal, corporate, governmental. Understand that excessive debt, growing faster than the income needed to support it, is a fundamental source of instability. Be mindful of it in your own life, and watch for its signs in the broader economy. Second, embrace history, not as a collection of dates and names, but as a laboratory of human behavior and economic forces. Dalio's work is a powerful reminder that the challenges we face today are often echoes of the past. Understanding how previous generations navigated similar circumstances offers profound lessons and helps us avoid repeating the worst mistakes. Third, cultivate adaptability. If Dalio is right about being in a period of significant change, the ability to learn, adapt, and navigate uncertainty will be crucial. The world order, the nature of money, the political landscape, these things that seem permanent, can shift, sometimes rapidly. Staying informed, thinking critically, and being flexible in your plans and mindset will be key. Finally, remember that while these cycles are powerful, human choices still matter immensely. How leaders manage debt crises, how citizens engage in political discourse, how nations choose to interact. These decisions shape the trajectory within the cycle. Dalio's proposed solutions, like his 3% plan for the U.S., are examples of trying to consciously navigate the cycle toward a better outcome. That was our deep dive into the core ideas of How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle, by Ray Dalio. We've journeyed through the mechanics of debt, the stages of the big cycle, the interplay of the 5 great forces, and looked at how history continues to unfold along these timeless patterns. But honestly, we've only scratched the surface today. A summary like this gives you the map, but reading the book itself is like taking the journey. It's filled with detailed case studies, charts, and nuanced insights that truly bring these concepts to life. If the idea of understanding the hidden rhythms of the economic world intrigues you, if you want to be better prepared for the changes Dalio sees coming, I wholeheartedly encourage you to pick up a copy. It's not just a book about economics. It's a profound lesson in how the world really works, grounded in decades of experience and deep historical study. You can find a link to the book in the description below. And if you found this exploration valuable today, perhaps consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to Billionaire's Bookshelf. We journey through impactful books like this regularly, aiming to distill wisdom that can help us all navigate life a little better. Join us next time as we open another chapter together. Let's keep learning and growing.